Good evening and welcome to the Greg Tompsett Sports Show. You are joining us here this week with our special guest, Nick Korte from, you guys know him from Over the Cap and all his contributions there, as his Twitter handle says, being the compensatory picks guy. He's someone that I've gone to as a source as we've kind of gotten more and more into this over the years and learning more about it. Nick, how we doing?
Doing well. How are you doing?
Good, good. It's interesting. I know, I apologize on behalf of Bills Mafia. I think you got the brunt of a lot of the frustration this year because people saw you as the go-to resource for how the offset works and all the different parts of the equation of the compensatory pick formula. And everybody was kind of counting on a third round pick this year. So before we get into explaining what happened there, how did you become that person? How did you get into this niche? How did you carve out this space as being the compensatory pick guy?
Okay, so many years ago, this was like around turn of the century. There was a guy who went by the name Adam JT13 who would project that on his own and did a really good job with that. And I learned the rules about how all that worked. Then he stopped doing it around the time when I started getting to work on Over the Cap, and I realized that once we had all this contract data, I could not only just do my own projection, but also just get it updated in real time as teams made signings in free agency to kind of bring even more awareness and excitement to it. So I think I've been doing that since the 2015 NFL draft, I think. So that'd be 10 years of projections. So it's just something that I kind of fell into and figured out that I could be good at it. And, like you said, I've carved off that niche to kind of just help share more information to the NFL world.
No, that's awesome, man. It's obviously one of our goals at Cover One is taking those complex parts of football and the game that everybody loves and make it a little more digestible for people. So I know, in recent years, your hit ratio had been incredibly high. There was a couple different things. I think last year there was maybe somebody with the cutoff between a third and a fourth. And then this year, the big one was less apparent to everyone. Obviously there have been people who have followed in your footsteps and dove into it even more and more and kind of understood the different areas. And both the 49ers with Jimmy Garoppolo and the Bills with Tremaine Edmonds and their signings, it didn't seem to be debatable. It didn't seem to be, anywhere close to the line. They seem to be like pretty clear definitions based on the previous equation. We saw not as much vocally from the 49ers and John Lynch, but Brandon Beane in his press conference shared that he reached out to the 49ers and together they reached out to the NFL basically saying, hey, what the hell? You confirmed to us multiple times during the season that we were projected to get a third round pick. What changed here? And then there was another bit of a kind of a dark period here with no information. And now a little bit more has come out on what changed and why it happened. Now, whether we agree is debatable, but maybe try to talk through a little bit what that process was like in having the projection, seeing the difference in an area that was not very clear or transparent, and then piecing together what happened after that presser and now the new information that's come out.
Yeah, so just to start, teams get a third-round compensatory pick if they have a player that left in free agency that was not canceled off by another signing. If that player ranks in the top 5% of league-wide players according to the compensatory formula. And throughout the entire process, both Edmonds of the Bills and also Garoppolo and McGlinchey of the 49ers, but they also signed Hargrave, who the Eagles got a third-round pick for as well. They were all comfortably third rounders, as I could see in my projection. And in hindsight, it seems like that's the way Buffalo and San Francisco thought about it too. So when that release came out, and I saw that, it's just like, this just doesn't make sense. I can't make this work within. Sometimes, you mentioned those cutoffs when it's just off by just a few rankings, that's one thing. It's tough to estimate what the entire league-wide number of players that's considered. But this just made no sense. And I said as much right on Twitter immediately on that. And also potentially implicated the Bengals. And their fans got really happy with me when there was a correction that upgraded a pick of theirs to the third round, but still left the Bills and 49ers with a fourth. And so I was like, okay, this still doesn't make sense. So when Brandon Beane had that press conference, those were a few early clues trying to figure out, how on earth the NFL Management Council came to this calculation. And so that was a first step. Tried a couple things that got better, still didn't work. And then finally, we got some information that said that with restructured contracts, the NFLMC judges those as completely new and shorter contracts. And in the article I wrote that finally figured this out, I used an example of the player that I think Beane was referring to as one of these absurd cases, and just demonstrated in the numbers just how absurd that was. But the good news, at least, is once
I have that example here. You showed the restructure where there's an enormous non-prorated salary of 18 million coming up in 1 year. That's clearly not the average that you would, find for the total number. And that all of a sudden in this scenario, they would count this as a $28 million player.
Well, they counted it as a 2-year contract instead of a 5, which just doesn't make any sense. That's not how anyone would typically view an NFL contract. But the good news, at least for my projections, was once I made this adjustment for the players that had all these restructures, it lined up everything perfectly. And
so at least it cleaned up the calculation and how to do the projections going forward, even if it didn't make Bills fans and 49ers fans happy. Right. Learning how didn't change the fact that they still felt like they were getting the short end of the stick.
And it was confirmed that Beane was correct in saying like this much. I think he said with how them and the 49ers missed, and I agree with him that they got a raw deal, but it is what it is, and at least now I know how to proceed moving forward.
Yeah, and it's not perfect in the way that they do that. There's always that bit of wiggle room that's there. Before we get into pivoting to looking at this coming year and where they're at, because the Bills do have the potential of anywhere from 3 to 0. Like all of those things are in play. I think the 0 is probably pretty unlikely. It's pretty likely they'll get at least one, but they could get a second or a third, and which round those picks come from can change. For maybe fans who aren't as familiar with it, give the elevator pitch of how the compensatory pick formula works on what net gained means and what the qualifying contracts are.
Right. So it all starts with how many players that qualify as compensatory free agents leave versus signed. So if you don't have a net loss of CFAs, you have to have more leave than come in. If you don't have that, you're not going to get comp picks. After that, the rounds are valued primarily on average per year on APY, with an adjustment made for snap counts on offense, on defense, and an even smaller one made on postseason honors, which is only AP All-Pro and Pro Football Writers Association awards. So, but the APY is the dominant one there. Now there are, as we discovered last draft with the Bills and 49ers, how that's calculated has a few little tweaks to it. But that's probably the pitch in a nutshell there, without getting into too many of the more wonkier details.
So, and just to help people explain, I know a lot of fans, as soon as they see one of their players sign elsewhere, they're immediately go, oh, good, we'll get a comp pick for that. And I know even, unfortunately, some national reporters don't help with that as well. You see some people, their immediate response is, oh, well, they lost that guy, but don't worry, they'll get a compensatory pick for it. And it just simply doesn't work that way. You use the example of the Jets. Bryce Huff signed an enormous contract, a $17 million contract with the Eagles. And everyone's thinking, well, we didn't sign anyone big, so that shouldn't hurt us. But they signed the amount of players that it offset anything they would have got back. So even though none of them were that big of signings, I guess Tyron Smith's was short term, but kind of big, but nowhere near 17 million. They gained 4, they lost 4. That cancels out. You don't get any compensatory pick formula. So for everybody listening, that's what Nick and I are trying to help explain a little bit, because we're about to go into the Bills and we're going to go through. Nick actually built a really nice kind of visual of the different scenarios of what can happen for the Bills this year, in where they could get or lose some compensatory pick formula, some compensatory picks this year as it comes up. So one last thing, as I pull this up on screen here so we can show all of our different scenarios, help the fans. What is a CFA?
Okay, CFA is a compensatory free agent, and that player has to be first an unrestricted free agent. He has to have had 4 or more accrued seasons, and his contract must have expired. Players who are cut do not factor in
let's
to this.
Let's take a quick aside there. You highlighted that word because previously a lot of people had assumed that any contract that voided was not compensatory pick eligible, but now there's been a clarification or more education out there that if it expires, or if the void happens based on a set date or timing mechanism, that is an expiring contract. And if it's more like a player option or team option kind of void, I don't know if I'm explaining that part well, that is not compensatory pick formula, but the expiring void years do count towards it now, or we learned that they do now.
Yeah, the best way to keep voids in mind is look if they shorten the original length of the contract. If the contract is shortened, then it is not eligible. That player is not eligible to become a compensatory free agent.
Like Stephon Diggs just happened with the Texans. He originally had years on it. They shrank it down that he becomes a free agent sooner, with the void years letting that contract void out. That means that they would now not be comp pick eligible if he were to sign somewhere else in 2025.
Yep, that's correct. A great example. But most void years are just done for salary cap accounting, and it's rare that it actually shortens the contract. Like with Diggs, that was more of a negotiation with the Texans to agree to let him become a free agent at a shorter period of time in exchange for whatever the Texans wanted. Yeah.
So real quick, I'm going to share just so fans who are watching can see one of my favorite. Now it's so funny on my phone when I go to search for compensatory pick formula. Now Google says, like, you visit here often, and that thing comes up on Over the Cap when I pull it up. I was like, thank you, Google. I'm aware that I come here often, but thank you for reinforcing that for me. So I'm going to share, and I'll put this in the show link for anybody who's looking. A lot of what Nick's going to go through and a lot of what I use here is on overthecap.com. It's my favorite site for any salary cap elements and anything that's out there. And you'll see here what we're going to go through are the different scenarios that come into play with the players who are gained and lost. And there's actually an interesting element in some of the numbers that are involved, because the Bills this year, more than other years, I don't know that they never have, but the Bills have a lot more like borderline players than I ever remember in the past. It's really interesting to see how it came together. So very clearly, players who are going to remain in the equation: Gabe Davis and Leonard Floyd, their calculation APY of 13 million and 10 million. Those are going to stay in any version of this. The same thing they're signing to Curtis Samuel is going to stay in the equation no matter what. I think Dane Jackson and Terrell Dodson are 99.9%. They're both at 4.25 million, 4.26 million. Their rankings in the equation here is very, very likely to stay part of it. Then you start to get down into Austin Johnson, who we signed at 3.5 million. I'd say he's more likely than not. And then you get into Tim Settle at 3 million, Mike Edwards at 2.8, even Mac Hollins at 2.6. Nick's going to walk us through the different scenarios of where those players may or may not end up within the compensatory pick formula to be able to qualify. And that's what we're going to go through here today to show the potential outcomes that could happen as the season plays out with what he laid out. Not only what their compensation is, but with their playing time, if they were to win awards, some of the other factors. So Nick, when you show the APYs that are here, how are those fluid based on incentives that could be achieved, or is that pretty well set ahead of time on what the actual financial element is?
Yeah, starting with the 2020 CBA, they are a little fluid. Incentives will count under one of two conditions. One is if they are likely to be earned. That's a designation that the NFL places based
Which for
on.
anybody that's, did they achieve it last year? Did they hit that statistical element last year or not?
Yeah, and I try my best to add all the LTBEs in as I find them during this time of year. Obviously, some of them are more difficult to track down. But the ones I know of should already be in the formula. And then, of course, they also are factored in if the player earns them, which we won't know the answer until usually at or near the end of the regular season.
Yeah, and some of those, I know the most common one, the Bills just very recently signed Marquez Valdes-Scantling. He had 3 sets of incentives that were 3 tiers of catches, 3 tiers of yards, 3 tiers of touchdowns. All of them were starting just above what he did last year. So the initial calculation, not that he's part of this, but just as fans are familiar with those incentives, all of those are not likely to be earned. They won't hit the Bills cap this year. If he achieves those, they'll be factored in. It would count towards the Bills cap in 2025. And if he were a CFA, if he were signed prior to the date, that's another cutoff of the calculation year. I don't know if it's always like the Monday after the draft or a set date in the calendar, but it's always that week after the draft of anyone signed after
Since
that
the
point.
2020 CBA, it has been the Monday after the draft.
Okay. So, and obviously Valdes-Scantling was signed later than the Monday after the draft, so he's not eligible. But just as an example, he would be one where the initial calculation would have him as not qualifying. But in theory, if he hits all of his incentives, and this year, I think for him, it would be like 45 catches for 750 yards and 7 touchdowns, he would go to 4.5 million, which in theory would put him into the equation. So not that that's very likely that somebody hits every single not likely to be earned incentive, but in theory, there are guys who are below or even well below the threshold who could leapfrog into the equation and shuffle around the order from other players.
Yeah. And I didn't hear what his base APY was, but I'm guessing it was pretty low.
Yeah, 2.5 in cash. I think they gave him the 1.125 minimum salary, 1.125 also in signing bonus. They use void years to kick that out. So I guess in the new calculation, I'm not sure. Maybe that's not 2.5. Maybe that's the 1.475.
Yeah, no, that should be 2.5. It's really
what I
only
would have
the
thought.
restructures after the fact. But yeah, 2.5 would be right on that bubble of qualification that we're going to talk about soon enough with some of these other players involving the Bills. But you're absolutely correct that if he were to hit those incentives, his APY would be judged higher. And that is even if you're not a CFA, it's the league-wide players matter in the calculation. So if someone like Valdes-Scantling moves up, that might move other players down.
And with the scenarios we're talking about, with how close, especially the two that interest me are like the Tim Settle and Austin Johnson. I think it seems very likely that Mike Edwards will get bumped below. I even think it's pretty likely Tim Settle will. But in theory, you could even get to where Austin Johnson comes into wiggle room. And I didn't realize that the players who weren't compensatory eligible every player's compensation goes into the ranking and equation, which could bump those guys down. So the Justin Simmons of the world who haven't signed yet, the Yannick Ngakwe's of the world who
Mhm.
haven't signed yet, those guys, although they're not comp pick eligible, they do go into the ranking and could, if you have guys who are only 1 or 2 or 3 spots away from a cutoff, that could bump them down below where that threshold is. That's interesting information.
Right. And I mean, one player alone almost certainly won't make the difference. But if you combine a lot of those players together collectively, that's where, things can change.
Okay. So walk us through a little bit here on the different scenarios that you had built out here. You have one up at the top left. There's some check boxes of whether those players remain as part of the equation. And then we have here which comp pick the Bills receive, and I'll kind of highlight which bucket we're going after here. It seems like in 7 out of the 8 scenarios, the Bills get a 4th round pick for Gabe Davis. That seems very, very likely in most scenarios. So
Mhm.
I almost want to start with scenario 5 and explain the one where they don't, but go ahead. Let's start at scenario 1 and we'll walk our way through.
Yeah, I'm going to actually start at scenario 2 because
Okay.
that's the one that's currently projected right now.
Yeah. So if
And
anybody goes to overthecap.com, that's what they would see in there right now is both Gabe Davis and Leonard Floyd counting towards it as of right now.
yeah, and the snap count estimates on this, I use a average over the past 4 seasons. That's not perfect, but it's about the most accurate that I can come up with because I mean, if I were just to do last year, I mean, some players are on injured reserve all the time and they don't get any count, even if they like played all the snaps most of the time. I mean, there's always going to be some sort of variance that I don't have a crystal ball to project, but yeah, the snaps for Edwards, I wish I had those up. I wish I had the estimates from last year up that I have on right there. But Edwards obviously played a lot of snaps on defense with the Chiefs last year, whereas Hollins, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure who he played with last year. I'm not sure if he was more on special teams or if he just didn't get many snaps on offense.
Yeah, when you said the 4-year average, that piqued my interest because that does grab Mac Hollins' really big season 2 years ago in Las Vegas, where he played a ton and was arguably their number 1 wide receiver. And then last year in Atlanta, he did play and was in 13 games, but less so as a receiver, much more so specifically as a special teams player. So certainly something that factors into that
Yeah,
overall count.
yeah, I'm looking at it now, and it should be made clear that special team snaps do not count in the compensatory formula,
Interesting. Okay. They don't count at
except
all. Not
except
even
for
close.
except
Yeah.
for kickers and punters. But they don't have snap. They don't use snap counts. It's a different calculation altogether that I
Interesting.
won't get into right now.
So yeah, so Hollins, obviously the year 2 years ago where he played over 1,000 snaps, makes a big difference for him. Whereas just about every other season of his career is, 286, 340, 345, 411,
Yeah.
as what most wide receiver 4, wide receiver 5 guys play, which equates much more to what I expect this year with the Bills.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think when it comes to estimating these type of snaps, on a non-automated way, it's good to have a deep knowledge of the team itself and what observers think the Bills plan to do, with Edwards and with Hollins. And that's something where I always say, someone who covers the Bills like yourself probably knows that question better than others.
Yeah, and so Mike Edwards is one looking at the last couple years. It was 614. He had the 1 year with Tampa where he was truly a backup. Then 531, 814, 621 last year. A lot of those are 58%, 57%, 57%. With the signing of Taylor Rapp and the draft pick of Cole Bishop, I think that average is probably pretty healthy. I don't know that I see him coming in and playing 94% like he did in Tampa in 2022. It's certainly in the realm of possibility. He could grab that starting spot and just hold it every single snap. I do think we'll see some rotation, some movement between the three. So I think that's another one where the average over the last 4 years is probably pretty healthy.
Yeah, and that's a great observation here as I look at, especially with the drafting of Bishop in the second round. I mean, you hope that you hope that your rookies can play right away, but realistically, most of them take some time to
Yeah.
adjust, and that's where an Edwards might come in and fill in those snaps if Bishop still needs a little bit more time.
Yeah. So in that scenario, in scenario 2, we have Mac Hollins not being in the equation, being below the line. We have both Mike Edwards, obviously Austin Johnson, and Tim Settle being part of the equation here, which Dane Jackson and Curtis Samuel cancel out, Terrell Dodson and Austin Johnson cancel out, Tim Settle and Mike Edwards cancel out. That leaves Gabe Davis and Leonard Floyd. One of the other players, obviously, that we talked about here was Tim Settle signing with the Texans. And I meant to look at that before we started here on other additions. And there wasn't any other significant addition for the Texans. It was, Fatukasi and Settle. So depending on where they play Danico Autry, who I see is a little more as a strong side kind of edge type guy, but it certainly seems like Tim Settle is going to play for them. I don't know if it's start. I don't know if it's more snaps than what he had last year, but it certainly seems like he's going to be part of their equation for it. So I do expect him to be there as maybe probably similar to what he was with the Bills last year. He played 379 snaps last year as kind of our number 3 defensive tackle. That kind of seems like the case here with Houston. There was no significant draft investment. They lost both their guys, so bringing in Fatukasi and now having Settle, that seems like their primary. And then with Danico Autry, so having Settle third, I think that his 4-year average is probably about right as well. That seems like a reasonable estimate short of an injury with Houston.
Yeah, and I'm looking at Settle's career snaps. He's never played more than 35% of the snaps in any one season. And it should be noted that players only get a boost in snap counts if they play at least 1/4 of the snaps on offense or defense. So, we'll see how much Settle plays. But, that's where the injury factor comes in. If he were to go down for the season week 1, then he's not going to get any snap count boost in the formula. And that could really affect as to whether or not he makes the cut of qualifying as a compensatory free agent.
Are there other thresholds? Are they in like 25% increments as they go up? Is it like 25, 50, 75?
Yeah, the way it works is you have to have at least 25%, and that will get you 25 points. Then anything above that is the same number of points as snaps rounded down to the nearest whole number. So if you had 74.5, you'd get 74 points.
Okay. So based on his career, if he played 34% of the snaps for the Texans, he would get 34 points in the equation. That kind of
correct.
Stuff. Okay. All right. So now what would be the difference if we went from scenario 2 back to scenario 1, where now all of a sudden Leonard Floyd is canceled out?
Yeah. So, this would be a scenario where both Edwards and Hollins get significant play time with the Bills. We talked about Edwards' possible role with the team in 2024. What do you think Hollins' role would be on the team as it stands right now? They did draft Keon Coleman, I see.
Yeah, so drafting Keon Coleman, they've obviously brought in a lot of similar type of guys like the Chase Claypool, Quintez Cephas, and obviously most recent signing of Marquez Valdes-Scantling. I actually think all of those speak to Mac Hollins being more and more of a special teams maven, which obviously he's been a special teams captain on 3 different teams. That's where his value is, that size. I do think that he's capable of playing receiver. We saw the production he had with Las Vegas 2 years ago. It is within his skill set. I think all the other moves tell me he's much more wide receiver 5-ish. And I would say if I had to bet on whether he would hit above or below 25% of offensive snaps specifically, I think he would be just below that. And I think in much of his career, he's been kind of borderline back and forth, a lot of them right at 25% of
Mhm.
the snap count. I think that he might trigger 25%. I'd be shocked if it went much above there. Between 25 and 30 would
Yeah.
make sense. And if he came below 25, I would not be surprised.
Yeah, I mean, so much of that, will come down to injury,
Yeah.
how who gets hurt and when, and also coach's decision, what type of snaps does McDermott and his staff feel is appropriate for each receiver.
Hollins is a really good blocking receiver, so you never know some of those things. Last year, they used Gabe Davis almost as a second tight end in some run plays. As far as body types, maybe Keon Coleman takes that, but I could see Mac Hollins
Mhm.
doing some of that in jumbo sets and large running sets. So those are snap counts. That's a snap that would be played on offense, even if it's not a passing play. I could see some of that come into play. Right now, I would guess that he would fall below there, and
Yeah.
would not be in his favor in the
Yeah,
equation.
and I think that's a good educated guess to make, which is what we see in scenario 2 there, which is what's projected right now. And it's always good to hear from those who follow the Bills to, know more of the details to get a feel for, how accurate that projection will be.
Okay. Um, then we have basically scenario 3 is the same as scenario 2, just swapping. This would be if Mac Hollins played a high
Yeah.
snap count, but Mike Edwards didn't. Scenario 2 is Mike Edwards plays enough snaps to qualify, Mac Hollins doesn't. Scenario 4 is the one that Bills fans will like the most. This would be basically if the rookies play really well. So Keon Coleman plays a ton of snaps, makes it so we don't need Mac Hollins to be a run blocking receiver. He takes up those snaps plus all the receiving snaps we expect him to play. Cole Bishop is ready right off the bat, and maybe Cole Bishop and Taylor Rapp are the starting safeties, and Mike Edwards is the third safety who comes in just dime packages or different three safety looks. In that scenario, if Tim Settle remained qualifying, that's the one where you would still net out 3 comp picks with Gabe Davis as a 4th, Leonard Floyd as a 5th, and now Tim Settle as a 7th comes back into play.
Yeah, and I think you said it really well. If scenario 4 happens, then I think very good things are happening for the Bills in general. And I feel
I like that
I feel
moment.
like being in company would probably see that 7th as just a nice to have.
Correct.
But I think I would imagine that their priority is hoping to get that 4th and 5th.
Yeah, and we've seen obviously with the moves that they've made, some of the other trades, they'll get the 2nd for Stephon Diggs. They also traded this year's 5th for Chicago's 4th next year. So they already had 2 4ths there. Now being in a spot where you could have a 3rd, 4th round pick, they'd actually traded away the future 5th, so you could get it back here. So they could be in a spot where you have a 1st, 2 seconds, a 3rd, and 3 4ths plus your 5th and later on picks. So being with that many early on would certainly give them a lot of ammo to move around. So now the scary one, walk us through how would scenario 5 happen?
Well, this is the one where, now Edwards and Hollins are playing enough snaps to qualify for whatever reason, but also for whatever reason, Tim Settle falls likely below that 25% snap threshold that I talked about. He gets no bonus for snaps. And that leaves us in our unfortunate situation where the Bills have lost as many free agents as they've gained. Now, why is there still that net value 7th there? That would be because the value of the players that were lost is significantly greater than the players that were gained. It's a pretty rare compensatory pick to be awarded because most teams are usually planning, if they know they're having a big loss, they're going to try to plan against that. Or if they're content with canceling out, they'll just go big and say, well, let's go make a big signing of our own, and we think that'll be worth it. Yeah, I think this is very unlikely given what we've talked about with these 3 players, but certainly not impossible.
Okay. And then so scenarios 6, 7, and 8 are fairly similar. scenarios with just one or the other jumping off. So this one is to be completely honest, my projection is probably closer to scenario 8. If I had to put my chip on one, I would probably wager that all 3 of them fall below the threshold based on the scenarios that they're there, that Tim Settle would fall below, Hollins and Edwards would both fall below, and that we would probably have the net out be the Bills get the 4th and the 5th because they had Dane Jackson and Terrell Dodson cancel out Curtis Samuel and Austin Johnson. I think that's my guess would be the most likely to happen. But this goes through each of them where in scenario 6, you have Tim Settle falls off, but so does Mac Hollins. That still protects Gabe Davis because Mike Edwards made it onto the equation. Scenario 7 is Tim Settle falls off, but Mike Edwards falls off. Mac Hollins makes it into the equation, but that still protects Gabe Davis. And then, like I said, scenario 8 is all 3 of the borderline guys fall below. Tim Settle, Mac Hollins, and Mike Edwards all fall below the threshold, and that would bring Gabe Davis and Leonard Floyd back into play. And if you look at the overall, it shows that in 4 in half of the scenarios, scenario 2, 3, 4, and 5 and 8, and scenario 2 is the one right now as is, if everything stayed exactly the way it is. In half of them, Gabe Davis and Leonard Floyd are in play. You get the 4th and the 5th. In 7 out of the 8, Gabe Davis's 4th round pick is in play. That seems like by far the most likely that they at least have that. And then in a handful, you cut it down to just Gabe Davis. In 3 out of the 8, you only get his 4th round pick. So I think most of the outcomes here, like you said, the 7th round pick is kind of a bonus anyways. It's something that I don't think a lot of teams put a ton of value in regardless. They're at least looking at getting a strong value back for Gabe Davis.
Yeah. And when it comes to scenario 8, I think the way that one happens is if the NFLMC just judges the total number of league-wide players at the end of the regular season to be very high. And when that happens, it's just going to keep, it's going to make it, I have that backwards, where it's very low, because that would up those cutoffs and make it harder to qualify as a compensatory free agent right there. So
Interesting.
It would be a situation that the number's usually around 1,900 players, but if it was like more in the 1,800s or so, that would probably be where scenario 8 comes into play.
Okay. Interesting. So again, this is a really interesting discussion, something that a lot of folks have, really come to follow you and trust your work over the cap and on Twitter. Let the folks know what else you have going on, what other things you're working on over the cap, and some of the other things you guys have coming up that they could check out.
Yeah, well, things are just going to go, a little bit silent in the NFL around this time. They try to manufacture stuff like the schedule release right now. But it's a good time to just take a step back and look at how the site is doing. There'll probably be some maintenance things that I will take care of during this time. But it's always a good time to just maybe look at some trends, see, take a look at the data and see if there's anything new that pops up, and exactly what that is. I can't say at this point. We're always trying to, look at the data and try to make some more insights that can be useful for people following the NFL.
That's awesome. We really appreciate it. Like I said, I can't recommend all the things you guys do at overthecap.com enough. It's my go-to site for everything salary cap and financially driven in the NFL. You, Jason, so many of the others over at the site, Troy, have been, great, people to work with, and certainly helped educate me on more of what's going on within that space, and tried to help translate that over to NFL fans and to the Bills fans listening here. So we certainly appreciate all of your work and everything that you do. You guys will be able to find Nick's account and more of the resources we talked about in the show description here. But on behalf of Nick Korte, I am Greg Tompsett. You've been listening to the Greg Tompsett Sports Show, and we